Welcome to On Par, the podcast all about public administration based on work published in Public Administration Review. I'm Katherine Willoughby, co-editor-in-chief of the journal with Yost Radshelters. Together with our team, editor Hung Tao Yi and management analyst Preston Phillips through the journal, this podcast, and other affiliated outlets, we seek to bring you the latest information about emerging developments in governments around the world, advance theoretical and conceptual knowledge about governance and government, and connect and inform the practitioner and academic communities globally. PAR is accessible online through Wiley, and today we're talking with two eminent scholars who have recently published in Public Administration Review. Our guests today are Professors Whitney Afonso and Kim Nelson, both of the School of Government, University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Kim and Whitney, we'd love to hear about you, and we are excited to hear about your work. Kim, let's start with you. Can you provide us with a little introduction about yourself?
Sure. Kim Nelson at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I specialize in local government management, and so a lot of my research has been on form and structure of local government. I've been in Chapel Hill since 2013, and I do a lot of work with local government managers around the country on things like strategic planning and other types of consulting services.
Super. Whitney.
Hi, Katherine. Thanks for having us on the podcast today. So I'm Whitney Afonso. I'm a professor at UNC as well. And my area of expertise is actually public finance at the state and local level. But fundamentally, what I'm most interested in is understanding how the choices that governments make impact their behavior and the constituents that they serve and how they respond to those behaviors. And so I, like Kim, have the opportunity to work with state and local officials in North Carolina and beyond. And I was really excited about this project because it's another way that we're able to look at how some of these structures and how the choices that governments are making will impact ultimately service provision for residents and ourselves and our neighbors.
That's wonderful. And it sounds like in your work at the School of Government and engaging with practitioners in this way helps you develop research ideas and stay connected to what's happening on the ground. Is that true?
Absolutely. That's one of the best parts about our roles at the School of Government is that we get to translate our own work and the work of folks like you, Katherine, to the people actually out in the field doing this work, but we also get to see where they are hitting barriers or where they have questions or new and emerging issues. And that absolutely informs the research that we choose to do and our understanding of the importance of these questions and the nuance that's often involved in this research area.
Well, tell us specifically what prompted y'all to write this article about corruption and form of government at the local level in the United States.
Well, so I have been studying form of government for quite a while. And of course, the reform types of government, including council manager reform, were created during the progressive era, which was a time of, a lot of political machine types of corruption. And so council manager reform was actually touted as an antidote to corruption. But no one has ever tried to prove that it works in that way. And so I was interested in that, and I approached Whitney, and it really helped that my co-author was completely skeptical that there would be any relationship between form of government and corruption.
That's neat. Yeah, that's a great way to get started with research is folks that have differing opinions about what might be going on. So Whitney, tell us, can you distinguish for us and our listeners out there between the principal agent model and the professionalism performance model in terms of its implications for form of government and activities of those governments?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the big contributions of this paper is, as far as we know, we're the first to really test this competing hypothesis framework and looking at the impact that these two different frameworks might have in the way that they function. And so What we're really looking at here is we have the principal agent theory, and the way that we imagined applying that to form of government and corruption is essentially if the public is our principal, their agents are their elected officials, and they're held accountable through re-election and in strong mayor governments. What we would see there is the buck stops there. And so those mayors want to be re-elected, and they're going to be incentivized to essentially manage their governments well and to minimize bad acts such as corruption. On the flip side of that, we have the professionalism performance model, and this is one that Kim actually had developed previously. And this is the idea that we have a different set of incentives that are actually driving these behaviors. And moving away from those political incentives to these administrative incentives, it allows that manager who is accountable not just to the mayor, but to the council and this diffused political power. And they are able to be accountable in a way, but also driven by their own professionalism and their own training and goals. And that they will, in turn, incentivize the people that they're responding to and their community to perform at a very high level. And that difference between the political and administrative incentives explain the differing outcomes in these two theories. So principal agent, we hypothesize that mayor council would come and have less corruption, and that would in fact lead to better governance. And under the professionalism performance model, we would expect the opposite, that the council manager form would perform better. And we think that this was a really exciting way to look at corruption, but we actually think it's really promising for a lot of other areas of government performance as well.
That's interesting. Give us some examples of other areas to apply this to.
Well, if you're going to ask me, Catherine, you know that I'm going to go straight to the budget. And so I don't want to derail this too much by getting the two of us started. But, these choices that we make on allocations and how we decide to divvy up dollars in our local government and where to invest and how that reflects the values and the needs of our community. I would expect that under the principal agent and professional performance that we might see meaningful differences, and we haven't really explored how these allocations might be impacted by form of government and where those underlying incentive structures lead us.
Fantastic. Yeah, we can apply it to all areas in government, and there's a lot to do here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Kim, explain to us the key influences on form of government that are chosen by localities in the United States that, of course, are very powerful, comparatively speaking, if we look at localities in other governments around the world. And how do these influences hold up today?
Yeah, so that's a really complicated question because there are associations with form of government, primarily along demographic lines, like council manager form is seen in this medium to medium large size communities most commonly. The urbanization and growth rate have some influence traditionally on the form of government choices. Some of that can be explained by the fact that council manager form is seen in places that are that were incorporated later on in our country's history, and so after the birth of council manager form. So we do see some regional influences, see more in the southeast than we do in the northeast, for example. But what we see today is a big push by particularly mayors and other actors in government away from the council manager form and towards a strong mayor, executive mayor form of government. And interestingly enough, they use an argument of greater accountability. So they say there's greater accountability at the ballot box. And of course, our study showed that is not the case. And so we aren't seeing a lot of trends away from the council manager form of government, but we do see this push, and the argument that's being used today is that there is better accountability in the mayor council form, when in fact there's really no evidence of that.
Does how does crisis of any sort impact localities abandoning a particular form of government, or does it?
So it depends on the type of crisis. So one of the most famous and more recent changes in form of government that I would say resulted from a type of shock was New London, Connecticut, which of course was the subject of the Kelo decision, which is a very famous Supreme Court decision that ruled that eminent domain was a legitimate public purpose. Eminent domain for economic development was a legitimate public purpose. And so after that decision, New London switched from council manager to mayor council form, and all the elected officials lost their positions in the government. So that was considered a direct reaction of the populace against this idea of seizures for economic development purposes. We don't see as much related to like a natural disaster, for example. There's not a lot of trending in form of government based on natural disasters. Of course, the original one that got commission form started was the Galveston hurricane in 1900, of course, but we have not seen that very much since then.
That's interesting. Talk a little bit about y'all's hypothesis in this work and considerations for why form of government would impact corruption in localities.
Yeah, so Whitney did a nice job discussing the two models and the hypotheses that go around that. So I won't repeat those. I will just say that, you know, I came into it with some bias, of course, which is why it was so great that Whitney did not share my bias. And I believe that council manager reform would be protective against corruption. And I believe that would be the case for two reasons. One is the fact that I believe, and what we've shown in our research is that in the council manager form, you know, the professional training of a manager helps them in choosing to implement internal controls and understanding risk management, and also, you know, hiring based on professional qualifications and not political variables. Whitney talked about the incentives in place for one form of government versus another, and I think that's the key there too. And then the principal agent model, really, we hypothesize that if indeed this is true, that we hear so much around the country that the electoral accountability is a strong incentive to keep elected officials true towards the best interests of the electorate, then we would see a lower chance of corruption in those places. Because we found that that was not the case, I think that it shows that there are some real gaps in this type of accountability at the ballot box, and therefore we need to use caution when we're thinking about that. And
In your-
so oh, go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, because I was thinking about the training to prep, you know, both mayors and managers for their work. I mean, I know at institutes of government, they have trainings for newly elected officials as well as those, you know, ongoing certificate work and other work for managers in the bureaucracy. In y'all's experience, tell us a little bit about the distinctiveness of training new mayors versus training new local government managers.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've been on the road training new elected officials since the beginning of January. I won't finish up until the end of February. So this is front of mind for me. I think that, you know, when we're training new elected officials, we're training them on how to work well together. We're training them on the legalities that are going to affect their positions. We do a lot of work with them on things like open meetings requirements, and we do ethics training. North Carolina and many other states mandate ethics training for elected officials. And so we do that work. It's very different, though, from what most managers receive, particularly if they received an MPA degree, which is still the primary credentialing that managers have, as well as the ICMA certified manager training that they take. And so I think that, elected officials get some training in budgeting and finance, and Whitney can speak more to that. But they don't get the same types of training that people who receive an MPA degree get in things like, managing risk and thinking about where there might be weaknesses in their systems, and where they need to protect the local government.
And I think that's a really key piece is they're all public servants. They're all there to serve their communities, but the backgrounds tend to vary really tremendously. Elected officials may not have any experience in local government at all. Their experience may be completely in the private sector, whereas a typical manager has more background somewhere in local government and frequently an advanced degree like an MPA.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you use a propensity score methodology in the study that connecting corruption and form of government. Talk a little bit about this methodology and why it was a useful tool for you in this case.
Yeah, so this data is tricky to deal with. And we had actually done an earlier study, also published in PAR, looking at corruption and form of government. And the good news for, residents of all these local governments from across the country is there are not that many instances of corruption at the local level when you exclude public safety, especially, which is what we did. But that means that we have very few occurrences that we're trying to model. And in the case of this paper, look at causality for. And so in the previous work, we had done something called zero inflated negative binomial. But in this piece, we had an extra decade of data, so more occurrences and more observations. And we were able to use some propensity score methods. That was really exciting because it gave us that causal analysis that we had really been wanting to use. And so the advantage of using these propensity score methods, not just matching, which is pretty common in PA these days, is there's a challenge with this data. Form of government is not randomly assigned. We have this self-selection bias, even when that self-selection happened decades ago in some cases. And so there's the concern that it's not form of government that's driving this impact on corruption. It's something that's underlying the choice of form of government that may also be driving corruption. And that correlation isn't actually the treatment here being council manager form of government. And so by using these propensity scores, we're able to model the underlying likelihood that, in this case, a municipality would adopt the treatment or council manager form of government. And when we model that underlying one, we're able to compare treated and untreated municipalities. So in our case, council manager and mayor council, and how likely they are to get rid of that self-selection bias. And so it was a really great advantage to this work that we were able to bring in. And we used several methods because we really wanted to test this, including propensity score matching. We used propensity scores and regression adjustments and also inverse probability weighting. That's all in the paper, and I don't want to dive too far into the weeds on the methods here, but what was really excellent is while we found slightly different magnitudes of impact, we found really robust, consistent causal evidence that form of government was impacting incidents of corruption. And we feel really confident about it and really excited for other academics to pick up this research and run with it in other directions, and for practice to see the impact that some of these structures, including form of government, have on better serving our communities, in this case, fewer instances of corruption.
Yeah, that was a fantastic and clear description of how advancing methodologies can really provide details to the results that, offer clarity and logic that can be often difficult to tease out. So thanks for that. I do want to get at this corruption data because you collected corruption data on close to 3,000 municipalities across 30 years. That seems daunting. How did you go about collecting the data, and tell us a little bit about any pitfalls along the way?
Yeah, so the sheer volume was challenging, and it wasn't just the corruption data because we did use panel data. So form of government was challenging. I knew I had in my data set the form of government at current time, but I had to go back and find out what year they adopted that form of government, and that was challenging. And then as far as corruption, we were looking at convictions only, so that was an early decision we made. We were hesitant to use cases where people had been charged and not yet convicted because we were concerned that maybe you could argue that that wasn't actually a conviction. I mean, a corruption, since it didn't lead to conviction. So we weeded out arrests without and indictments that didn't lead to conviction. And we, as Whitney mentioned earlier, we did not use public safety corruption. So we used Department of Justice data, their annual reports on corruption cases, the professional integrity unit at the Department of Justice. And then we also did newspaper searches for that time period using keywords on different types of offenses that would likely happen in municipalities to try to make sure both that we had not missed anything and also to give us some more information about what happened with the cases. And so that we would have accurate information. So it took us years and it was a lot of data. And I can't remember how many hours it took to run the analysis, Whitney, so you may want to share that.
Yeah, we were dealing with a really large data set. And so depending on the methodology, it would take over 24 hours to run some of these models, which is daunting when you realize there's a mistake in your code and you're starting it all over again, which I think all of us have experienced from time to time. But it was really exciting to get to work with such a complete data set of 3 decades and, all municipalities over 10,000. So we're really proud of the work that went into building the data set and then the analysis that we were able to do with it.
Well,
And
you
I will.
should. Yeah,
Oh,
you should.
sorry.
I was going to say you should be. I mean, it's beginning to take me back to job control language and the stack of cards you'd take over to the feed the big computer and then come back the next day to get your system.
Yeah, I'd like to point out that we do admit there's a weakness in the study, and that's that we believe, although we can't prove it, that there are a lot of cases that never lead to any kind of criminal action, and therefore are not reported either in the media or in any government documents. We believe that it's likely that smaller incidents are the person is made to make restitution and dismissed, and it's quietly taken away.
Yeah,
So
sure.
we have no way of capture those to measure how many of those there are, but we suspect there are quite a few of those out there.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, your results indicate that form of government impacts incidents of corruption, and particularly that council manager governments reduce that occurrence, though mayor-council governments do not. In fact, you estimate, quote, a causal reduction in incidents of corruption between 45% and 70%, depending on the model. These are fantastic results. And while they confirm your findings of prior scholarship, don't they also allow for better counsel to governments looking to reform? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were really excited about the consistency and robustness of these results. And, some of this is getting into those factors about the influence of corruption. And so much of that existing research are factors identified that are outside government's control. And that's so frustrating for practitioners that are turning to the evidence, turning to the scholarship that top people are producing, and it's great work. And they ask, well, what do we do with this? We can't, especially in the short term, change our poverty levels. We can't, especially in the short term, impact our population. And so one of the things that we were really excited about with this research is our connection to the field and public administration's connection to the field is that we found something that governments actually have some control and autonomy over, and with form of government. And so this is an identification of a factor that they can actually move. And so that's one of the really important things, I think, is when you're looking at what can we do to impact this for concerned communities, for corruption, but I would argue once again, a lot of probably related areas around better governance. What are we able to do? And form of government is one of those levers. And so, as Kim has mentioned, she has long been an advocate for council manager form of government. And I suspect if you were to ask her what can they do based on these findings, her first answer would be adopt council manager form of government. So I think that's one potential outcome, but I think there are other implications of this research that are also really exciting.
Yeah, can I just add one thing too? Yeah, so we actually have published a book using the studies we've done for PAR, and then looking into taking the significance that we found, the variables that were significant, and going through real cases that experience corruption to give lessons learned and what kinds of things might local governments consider doing. And I think it is a good point that with mayor council, sometimes they can't change to council manager form. Indiana cities cannot adopt council manager form, for example. But there are things that they can do. And so what we often see is in reaction to corruption incidents, and particularly in bigger mayor council cities, they have been adopting independent offices of inspector general, for example. And these types of independent offices, if they are afforded an adequate level of independence, can help protect against some of those political forces that are at play that we believe lead to the greater risk in mayor council cities. And I will also say that even council manager form cities and municipalities can have corruption. In fact, Bell, California was a big example of this. And of course, Bell, California also had demographic indicators that put them at risk. And so it's really important to remember that if you have people who want to act in nefarious ways, then it's very hard to completely 100% protect against that, particularly they are the top leadership of the local government.
Here in Atlanta, where our city's actually grappling with the inspector general, they've got an oversight office that's been created in a previous administration, and it's been undergoing some stress with the current administration about duties, responsibilities, and actions. So there's a little bit of a warfare going on here in Atlanta over this right now, which is mayor council government. So that's fascinating. When you talk about that avenue to put a check on mayors. Yeah. So thank you. Well, this has certainly been an enlightening conversation, and I've learned a lot. Kim and Whitney, we really appreciate your contributions to PAR and to the field, and look forward to reading more about your work and your book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katherine. We were really glad to join you.
Super. And thanks to our listeners. We look forward to next time with you, and we will continue to examine the intersection of theory and practice of public administration. Let us know how we're doing. You can email us at par.editors@gmail.com. You can find us on Spotify, X, and LinkedIn, and other social media outlets. On Par is made possible by ASPA and our editorial team, with special thanks for podcast production to Jessica Rao, our Par editor assistant. Thank you.